Good afternoon. Just going to give a few seconds, make sure all the participants are able to roll in before we get started. All right. So good afternoon. Happy Friday. Thank you for joining us today. It's our fourth webinar of the year. We're happy to be discussing today executive communication and advising leadership. So today's webinar is brought to you by CSG South and the Staff Alliance for Intergovernmental Leadership Committee, also known as SAIL. For any of our first-time attendees, SAIL is a staff-only committee of CSG South made up of state legislative, executive, and judicial branch employees with the purpose of providing informational content such as this catered to educating government staff while also providing opportunities to network with your peers across the South. So if you have any questions about SAIL, please feel free to visit our website, the CSG South website, or contact me with any questions. And I'm Jaslyn Jones, a programs associate here at CSG South. So just a few housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded. Please feel free to use the chat and the Q&A function to submit any questions. We welcome and encourage audience participation, and we'll make sure to get to those questions at the end of the presentation. After the presentation, there will be a short link shared. Please feel free to take a moment to fill out that survey and let us know if how we're doing and if you have any feedback. So today's session will examine how staff can engage effectively with executive leadership by understanding when to offer insight, when to listen, and how to guide conversations and shape decision making. So to walk us through this discussion today, we have with us Tabitha Clark from the National Association of Government Communicators. She is their past chair and also communications director for the city of Perry, Georgia.
Well,
I'll pass it over to
yeah. Thanks, Jaslyn. So, hey, y'all, this is Tabitha Clark. As she said, I am the communications director for the city of Perry, right here in Middle Georgia. Super excited to be representing the National Association of Government Communicators and bringing you kind of this important topic. It's not easy to communicate with leadership sometimes. So, I am very excited to share this with you. So, Today, we're talking about something that is not always taught, but makes a major difference in your effectiveness. It's knowing when to speak, knowing when to pause, and how to guide leadership. So, this session is more about helping you move from being seen as a communicator in your field to being a trusted advisor, which makes you very, very valuable and irreplaceable. So let's talk about why this matters. So executives move quickly, and so do we, often with incomplete information and, of course, under a ton of pressure, which we all are. That means communication is not necessarily about messaging, it's about managing risk. The way that something is communicated can directly impact public trust, internal alignment with your staff, and the outcomes of what happens after this incident or after this situation. So let's talk about the leadership translation problem. So your role is translation. Executives think in outcomes, not necessarily in details. That's what teams are supposed to do. The public also reacts based on perception. You hear perception is reality. Well, in my experience, perception is not always reality, but it is taken for truth, unfortunately, with very little context. So if all of these are not aligned, that's when problems happen. And your job is to bridge the gap and ensure clarity against all three of these situations and these inputs. So communication is harder than ever before. which I'm sure is a great thing to hear on this Friday afternoon. So this is where communicators staff get stuck. Most communicators struggle not necessarily because of skill, but because of timing. And that's a skill that is cultivated through experience, through time, and through observation. Sometimes we speak too late, sometimes we speak too much, or sometimes we don't speak at all. The real challenge is knowing when your voice adds value and when it doesn't. Now, I will talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, but you want to observe your leaders and their communication habits. A skill like this is not formed overnight. If you are lucky and you have this skill automatically, that is perfect. But a lot of us don't. So that's why this takes time and experience, but it's definitely worth the effort for the outcome to be seen as that trusted advisor. So let's talk about when you must speak up. You need to speak up when there's a reputational risk, if there's public confusion, miscommunication, which if you're like my area, miscommunication happens on a daily basis and throughout the day multiple times. So unfortunately, that is even gaining in popularity. But the most important thing is your job is not to be agreeable, it's to be useful. And that's something that we have to remember. Leadership is not going to always agree with our assessment, but it means also that we have to provide this information in a way that makes sense to them. So let's talk about the red flags. So these phrases that you see on your screen are completely big red flags. You'll hear things like, we'll just put something out quickly. This isn't a big deal, or we don't need to explain that. So these moments are where silence on your part actually creates a huge risk. Just remember, you must be the voice of reason and explain why that these situations demand attention. So I know that a lot of red flags happen, and these are only a few, but sometimes our leaders do not think of, risk in a way of public perception, stakeholder perception, and it's a real thing because if you don't cultivate a positive perception, that just leads to challenges later down the road. Now, one of the most common questions I get is, okay, I understand what you're doing. I understand what you're saying, but how do I actually speak to these leadership and executives without undermining? A lot of times, especially in my earlier career, I was told, stay in your lane. This has nothing to do with what you're doing. And what we need to do as communicators, as staff, is go, no, actually, this has a lot to do with the outcomes that you want. There's just several steps to take and think about before we either not speak too quickly, or speak for the wrong thing. So let's start with outcome. Leaders, an effective leader, let's put it that way, always thinks about the outcomes, whether it's a bottom line, whether it's wanting to get something across. It's always about the outcome. They want the bottom line. So let's think about in terms of framing your feedback around risk and not personal opinion, excuse me. You do want your professional opinion to be voiced because that's why you're there. That's why you were hired. Also, always bring a solution. Don't just come with a concern. Even if it's not completely fleshed out yet, you want to say, hey, this is the issue that I've identified, the risk. So let's think and talk through some possible outcomes on how we can communicate this effectively, or really go through what our options are. So executives, of course, just like the rest of us, we don't want pushback, but we do want clarity and direction. And that's where we need to really stop and think about not responding so quickly, but gathering all of our facts. So let's go through the top. When not to speak. So sometimes not speaking is seen as either taking a position or it's seen as incompetence but sometimes not every moment needs your voice. So let's stop and think about when not to speak. Emotionally charged moments. Sometimes, if you speak without a strategy or without being on the same page for emotionally charged moments, you're already adding gasoline to the fire. So, we want to take a step back and say, okay, what are the emotions? What are the expectations here? And how can we go through that and come out better on the other side? Not always an easy task. Incomplete information. If you're dealing with a crisis, especially, or if you're dealing with something that kind of blindsides you, you're not going to have all the information. Sometimes you just won't until time passes by. So make sure that you have all the information that is readily available to discuss and to create that strategy for thinking. And then, of course, when the decision is not final, a lot of the times that we, especially in our line of work, decisions take forever and decisions aren't final for a long time. The public perception and people, if you haven't noticed, are the impatience is a big thing. They want answers now and they want complete answers. And unfortunately, that's just not the way it works. But remember, not every moment needs a voice or not, doesn't need an immediate voice. So let's talk about the strategic pause. Strategic pause is what your power is. Pausing is not passive, it's strategic. You're listening, clarifying intent, and anticipating the questions that will come as a result of the situation you're facing. That preparation, that strategic pause ensures that when you do speak, your input lands. You want to make sure that you have an opportunity and ability to actually sit down, pause for a moment. I know in a crisis communication course, especially the ones that I have taken, say we need to make sure we get the information out fast. That's true in certain situations. But if you have the ability to just take a few minutes, sit down, look at your situation, look at what questions that could be asked that if you can answer, you need to sit down and think about that. Don't go into a situation blindly. It is okay to pause. Now, when we're talking about pausing, we're not talking about days necessarily, especially when it's in a crisis situation. But if it's a situation that, is you think it's going to bubble up, it's going to fester, take the time to pause. There is nothing wrong with that. So your role. So communicators, staff that dabble in communication, there's a lot of misconceptions. We are not an order taker. We are an advisor. Our roles have really expanded and evolved in the past several years. Used to, we send out press releases. Used to just submit on social media, something. That's not where our profession is going. That is not where staff needs to stop. We need to be an advisor in situations, especially when there's risk involved. If you're only executing tasks, you're replaceable. You are not necessarily seen in that light of a strategic communicator, a strategic staff member. However, if you're advising, that's when you become essential. That's when, if you don't already have a seat at the table, that's where you take steps to get that seat at the table, because we need to be involved in leadership discussions and leadership actions. That's the only way that we can really be effective in our jobs and what we do. Your role is to provide strategic counsel and not just messaging support. So again, if you're only drafting, if you're only doing the social media, if you're only doing press releases, if you're only doing those flyers, that's when you're replaceable. You're not taken as seriously. You're great communicators, you're great professionals, you have a lot to offer, but you have to think in terms of advising and providing that guidance to leadership that makes you essential and ultimately extremely valuable. So how do you get there? So how do you get from, staff member that does all of these tasks to a trusted advisor? So, trusted advisors do three things consistently: they translate risk, they simplify complexity, and they recommend direction. Don't just provide information, they provide clarity to these executives and this leadership. Sometimes, in my experience, leaderships will, they've been involved, they're really in the trenches. They use jargon, they use things that people are not going to understand, especially in government. We have so many jargons and we have so, just like any other. But the normal average person that's trying to get this information that these executives and this leadership group wants to get out, sometimes they just don't understand that if you use that jargon, A, it dehumanizes. B, you're not reaching your impacted outcome. You want to change behaviors or educate. You can't do that when people don't understand what you're saying. So, as communicators, as staff members, we need to take the complexity of what these executives and what this leadership is trying to say and simplify it. Some people say dumbing down, but just simplify it in a way that the audience that you're trying to target and trying to communicate with will actually understand. That is a massive, challenge that we have, to ensure that what leadership is saying is relatable to the audience that we're trying to speak. So again, how do we guide without overstepping? So the way that I've approached it, I've been in public sector communications for over 16 years. So I've seen a thing or two and I've learned the hard way over a lot of things. Um, so if you want to be seen as that trusted advisor, as somebody who understands both the business or the government, as also you understand what people need to hear, how to effectively communicate that message that leadership wants to do. You have to use language that aligns with leadership goals. You want to tie these goals to the outcomes that leadership wants to provide. And then you want to stay focused on solutions. Remember, kind of look at it as a lens. You're not challenging authority, you're just protecting the outcomes that they want to have in the long run. So, being a partner, using that language of alignment, that's when you can use the jargon and say, hey, we want to communicate this on an XYZ level. Completely understand. In our audience and how we want to communicate, they're going to understand this as XYZ. So let's talk about how we can communicate this while achieving our goals, but communicating it effectively. So this is the filter that I want to give you something practical. And at the end, we'll talk about a download that you can download, that kind of gets a little bit more into the weeds with this. But before you speak to your executives or your leadership, ask yourself three questions. Is this the right moment? Is this the right framing? And is this helpful to leadership? This is your mental checklist. If you don't pass all three, then you need to adjust. So let's talk about the right moment. I'm sure with bosses, you've been like me, and there's just days that probably not the best to approach. They're stressed. They have a million things going on. That's going to be probably the majority of the days. But what you want to do is observe your leader and your executive really a lot. That's when I talk about this is what takes time. You want to see kind of the communication habits of your leader. You want to see, when are they most likely? Is it the morning? Is it the afternoon? And those seem like simple things, but if a leader is not ready to be receptive to what you're having to say and how you can advise them, you need to find the right timing. That comes with observation and that comes from experience and really relating to that communication style that they have and the way that they want to receive that communication. Is it the right framing? This goes back to the last slide. We want to make sure that we frame a solution by advising our leadership of their goals. Use their jargon when talking to them and let them understand, yes, they understand what the end goal is. They understand, the complexity. But then it's your job to translate that into how we communicate that out to the public. But actually establishing that relationship with that leader and saying, "Hey, I know what you're talking about. I know how complex this is. So let's break it down and figure out how we're going to communicate your message in a way that makes sense and the way that's most impactful." And the last thing, which I think is kind of the most important, is it helpful? We can see a lot of things that our leaderships are doing that they can do better. Probably they say the same thing about us. But really, when you pick and choose your battles of what you're advising, if it creates a huge risk, yes, that is something that you want to make sure that you are constant communicating about and you provide that, um, advice to them. But if it's something that is not necessarily a big deal, and something that you can kind of talk about, in another setting or something, or another time, just make sure you don't always come to them giving them advice or advising them on a situation that really doesn't make sense as far as communicators. However, you need to have the discernment of when it's important and when it's not. And unfortunately, I can't give you a good answer if you don't already have that skill kind of naturally, and like me, have to learn that over time. But start that relationship now, start that observation now. So when the time comes, you're ready to discern, yeah, this is a situation where I feel like I need to advise them. So whenever you do go and provide that advice or provide that feedback and framework, they know that you're not going to come to them for every little thing. They know it's important. So let's talk about the key takeaways from this presentation. Timing builds trust. Remember that just like we have to have a conversation and build trust with the people that we're communicating with, whether it be the public, whether it be internal staff members, timing is essential. And unfortunately, in today's world, trust is very fragile. Trust can be, you spend years coming up with trust and, trying to put the positive stuff out, trying to be transparent. And you work on that for a long time. And then something will come along and damage or completely destroy that trust in a heartbeat. And it's not fair and it's very frustrating. However, using the time that we have now when there's not a crisis or when there's not turmoil going on, use this time to build relationships with your key executives and leadership and do that observation. What do they like? What do they not? How best do they receive constructive feedback? And how do they not? That's how you can start today. And that only takes time to build. Framing builds influence. Remember that you have to really kind of be kind of a split personality, if you will. You have to talk on the executive level, the leadership level, speak in their language, understand goals, understand alignments, understand what they're facing. But then you have to translate that into a completely different type of vernacular. You're going to have to take these complex issues and then present them to the public. And that is why it's so important for us to let our leadership know, yes, we understand this part, but here's how we can make a bigger impact in either influencing a decision, posting that information out so people will understand it. Because transparency, in my professional opinion, is not just throwing stuff out there, throwing the jargon out there. Transparency is communicating the information in a way that makes sense, giving them the information, but also talking about, hey, this is how it affects you. That is effective communication. And then three, guidance builds value. So remember, the role that we have is not the same that it was 10 years ago. It's not the same that it was 5 years ago. We should be looked at as trusted advisors that can see the big picture, but can also translate that complexity into a way that achieves our goals, achieves the communication for the most impactful and the most effective. And therefore, the bottom line is making sure that our offices, our entities are better prepared to, respond. And that over time builds trust. So this is a complex discussion. It's a skill that has to be built. As I said, time is the most important um, thing here. We have to observe and we have to ask the right questions. So what I've done is create a one-page, front and back, of course, of where you can get started, when to speak up, when to pause. This can be an overwhelming thing because we're dealing with a lot of different personalities. And sometimes we get those personalities really well, and sometimes we have challenging personalities that we have to figure out how we can best advise and how we can be the most effective in our roles. So you can scan this QR code. I've also provided the PDF version to your organization so that way they can send it out later. But this is designed to help you start on this journey to become that trusted advisor without trying to overwhelm. So I'm going to give you a few minutes or a couple of seconds to scan this QR code. And I hope that you find that it is a cheat sheet that is helpful for you. So going through this, thank you so much for listening and going over really the high level view of how we can advise leadership and how we can ourselves become effective communicators to make our role to be even more valuable. Even if you're not a communications person in your organization, a staff member that can be seen as that trusted advisor. You have a certain set of skills, a skills that not many people have. You're valuable, and you want to make sure that your skill set is looked upon like that. And that is also, if we're being honest, job security, being that person that they can go to and being where, when there's a situation, you can be the go-to person to help advise and ultimately understand how that message will get across. So, um, I'd love to answer any questions that you have. Jaslyn, I'm guessing, will you let me know or do I need to look?
Yeah, so thank you for
Okay,
that useful information. I do have a few Q&A questions
sure,
that we could go through to just help keep the discussion going for a
sure.
little bit and give people a second if they're going to submit, if the audience wants to submit any Q&As.
Sounds good.
So do you have any advice for how newer staff can build trust with senior leaders when they don't necessarily have a track record that they can point to about why they should be trusted?
Yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
So, visibility is so important. It's very important for you to be visible to your leadership. Whether that's, showing up to meetings, whether that's just a pop in their office, say, hi, is there anything you need from me today? Or, hey, I've kind of been scanning the environment, whether it be on social, whether it be on the news. I was like, and this is something I would like to discuss with you that could possibly turn into a risk later on. Take that initiative. But they're not necessarily, if you're going to be in your office all the time, it's a better way to be more visible. Because most of the time they're not going to seek you out unless there's something already going on. Um, Also, show a willingness to learn. Don't just stay in your lane, as far as what you do. Um, Talk to other departments, and just get a general sense of idea of what they do, because that can only help you in the long run. Just a little bit of knowledge is powerful. And if you're visible to other departments or other staff members, then, you're going to be known as, okay, she really wants, or he really wants to learn about what's going on, or can be helpful in some way. that also increases your visibility. So if you're very new or if you're like me and going into your later career, if you're not visible, if you're not there for, either the meetings, the conversations, or something like, or just popping in the office and saying, hi, just wanted to check in with you, see, make sure I don't need to do anything for you or you need anything. That would be my greatest advice.
Thank you. I think that's good advice. How also would you handle a situation where you may strongly disagree with the senior leader's direction?
So that's ne of course never happened before. No, I'm kidding. You can disagree a whole bunch, and that's where a lot of times we kind of rub together, especially if you're telling them something that they don't necessarily want to hear. I have learned a lot between legal and like communications. That's kind of like our lane right there. We tell them a lot of stuff going, hey, understand your idea, but this may not work exactly where you need it to work. So what I do is there is a soft approach. If you download that QR code, I give you
Mhm.
a soft approach and I give you a kind of a more forceful but yet tactical. I like to call it kind of aggressive diplomacy.
Mhm.
A ways to do that. So a soft approach would be, okay, I hear you. Can we think about this in a different way though? Or let me offer you a different perspective. It doesn't mean they have to take it, but you're able to get your thoughts out there. Now, if you are further along in your career or you have built that relationship over time, you can be a tad bit more diplomatically forceful and aggressive and say, hey, I understand what you're trying to accomplish here, but let me tell you about the risk. Let me tell you about how this is going to be perceived. And that also, as we talked about, that takes time to establish that relationship where you can get there. But if you start with those soft prompts, then you ultimately build, it's not being aggressive. It's not going, hey, you're wrong, and this is what
Mhm.
you need to do. It's all about diplomacy, but it's in how you word it and how you approach them.
Mhm.
So definitely take that free download, and that gives you several different examples of kind of how to prod them. Now, I am fully understand and aware that they still may say, you know, I still don't agree with you. We're going to go this direction. Happens all the time. But what, in my experience, a lot of times that whenever they don't necessarily take your advice and go down where the road they do, they learn a lesson kind of quickly. And then realize, hey, somebody, this person, such as Tabitha or whoever, says, did it this way. They may not admit it out loud, but that puts it in their head. Oh, okay. She looks at things from a different perspective. And hopefully the crisis or the situation isn't bad enough where it's detrimental. But at least for those small things, they'll remember that you're the one who spoke up.
Mhm. Thank you, Tabitha. Could you go back one slide
Absolutely.
for that QR code that you
Yeah.
mentioned? Lots of helpful tips and prompts there.
hmm
Another question is, do you have any techniques that that you use to help keep conversations focused and strategic when a discussion may start to drift?
Another one of those things that never happens, right? So you're in a meeting and the conversation drifts. Now, working in municipal government, I've worked in law enforcement, K through 12 public education throughout my career. So I've been in a lot of meetings where things are discussed, but then somebody will kind of railroad the conversation. And I've done a lot of internal eye rolling in my career as well, where I'm like, that's not what we're here to discuss. That goes back to the diplomacy where you can let them finish and then go, okay, I hear your point. I was like, but I really want to make sure that we clarify that we're all on the same page with the topic that we're discussing. That gentle correction, and talk about the importance of it. Say, I just want to make sure that we're on the same page with this before our meeting ends. Or I want to make sure that I understand what your position is, what the deliverables are, what are the to-dos. And kind of put it out like that, just to say, hey, let's kind of gear this conversation back. And it may take a couple of times to do this. But if you really need this information, you're going to be the one responsible for kind of gearing it back and saying, hey, I want to make sure that I understand this to the full extent so I can do a great job for you.
Mhm. Thank you. And then lastly, do you have any advice for how advisors can adapt their communication style across different leadership personalities, and organizational cultures?
Sure. So, as we talked about earlier, we deal with a ton of different personalities. It would be great if they all, communicated or, led the same way, but that's not going to be the case. I don't think in any job that we have. So one thing that's been super helpful for me is going back to that observation, going back to building those relationships with those different people. How do they like to communicate? I put on my communicator hat and go, okay, so if I need to communicate this information to this particular person, how would I do that if that was the public? Would I need to use more jargon with them to get them, on the same playing field? Do I need to look, does this person like to receive their feedback or their information as an email? Outlining all of the different, those really intensive emails that have all the details. Does this person prefer face-to-face communication? So you have to kind of treat them like you do the public or somebody that you're trying to communicate with. And that's going to be a lot of different types of skills. Like I said, but the observation, the relationship building, that's how I find out. Okay. So in my case, my city manager, he likes to be talked to face and then would follow up with an email with all the stuff that we discussed. So that way we can ensure we're on the same page. There was no miscommunication. My assistant city manager, he kind of likes the nitty gritty. He likes what's the situation? What are the risks? How are we going to fix it? So he's more of a don't get into the details, don't get into the weeds with me, get straight to the point. Whereas my city manager, he wants all the details, he wants everything. So to be that trusted advisor, you got to get on the alignment with that level. So not only do we have to communicate to the public, but we also have to use those same skills internally. So observing is definitely at the top of my list, especially when we get somebody new. And
Mhm.
just saying, hey, how would you like to be communicated with? Or, hey, how would you like to discuss this? Dumb questions are not dumb. They're just
Mhm.
information and knowledge for you to use later on.
Thank you. I did see that Stephanie has raised her hand.
Okay.
Stephanie, do you have a question? Maybe not.
Oh, I saw unmute.
Oh, Stephanie, you can go ahead.
Oh, technology's great when it works, isn't it? Not so great when it doesn't. I was about to say, if you want to put it in the chat or something, I'll be happy to answer it that way as well. And my contact information is also on that download. And then of course, please connect with me on LinkedIn as well. I'm happy to receive messages through there.
Yeah, okay. She said that it was an accident, but
Oh, okay. Well, hi,
okay, so she's
Stephanie.
good.
Good.
Yeah, Stephanie, thank you for being here. So seeing no more questions from the audience, I want to thank you again, Tabitha, for sharing your insights with us, and thank you to everybody else who attended as well. All our participants for today. All registered attendees will receive a follow-up email with the recording link and with these helpful additional resources that Tabitha has provided for us today. A recording will also be available on our website so that you can go and view it or share it if you would like. So we do look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar on May the 1st. It'll be titled Leading Through Change, Building Resilience, Trust, and Impact. It'll be another great discussion where you'll learn practical tools to guide teams through transition confidently, effectively, build trust, and sustain impact in dynamic work environments. So I hope you all have a great afternoon and, more importantly, a restful weekend.
Thank y'all. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Thank you, Tabitha.